Welcome to NDTR Spotlight, a show where we highlight former and current NDTRs. An NDTR, if you don't know, stands for Nutritionist Diet Technician Registered. They also go by the credential DTR, which stands for Diet Technician Registered. In order to become an NDTR, you have to graduate from an accredited program, take an exam, and participate in continual education. Welcome to NDTR Spotlight. I'm your host, Marie-Lorraine. Today, we have a really fun interview. A couple weeks ago on Instagram, I asked what the NDTR audience wanted to know about NDTRs, and the response was really just about private practice, entrepreneurship, and scope of practice as an NDTR. So after doing some digging and having that in the back of my mind, I ran across Nutrition by Irene, who is an NDTR with a private practice. She posted this really informative post on what an NDTR was, and which, spiked my interest a little bit more. I had been following her for a little bit, but I reached out to her and asked her if she would be willing to be spotlighted, and she graciously agreed to be on NDTR Spotlight. So she's going to shine light on what it's like having a private practice and just a little showing into what she's doing as a NDTR with a private practice. She does more than just nutrition. If you check out her website here, she also does finding joy in movement and being physically active, body acceptance, lactation support, navigating the healthcare system, local referrals, and mental health resources. So she's doing it all as an NDTR, and I'm really, really excited for this interview. And she also real quick, she has articles that talk about race and nutrition in a way that is informative and brings up important conversation. She has links to articles on white people and food, white supremacy and yoga, diet culture, rooted in racism articles, and just things that make you think. So this is an interview to watch if you are thinking about doing a private practice, or you want to talk about that nutrition and how it's related to race and how Americans are handling this conversation of nutrition and race. So do yourself a favor, grab a notepad. Irene is going to give us some really great free information. And so let's meet this infamous Irene.
Thank you so much for that intro. That was amazing.
So blown away by everything and those articles. Oh my, I'm excited. I'm excited for this interview. But we have to start with the normal question. What made you get into DTR, becoming a DTR?
I think a lot of different reasons actually led me to taking the DTR exam ultimately. I think the first one, honestly, was I just finished undergrad for nutrition and dietetics. And I went to school like a little bit later in life. Like I didn't go right out of high school. So I was like in my mid-20s when I graduated. So I was like going to school full-time and working full-time, like all at once. So it was a lot. And by the end of it, I was just like really burnt out. And I think like burnout is just really common within health professions, especially like med students, because there's just such like a huge emphasis on grades and GPA and stuff like that, which can be like really stressful. So yeah, I graduated and I was just like, I don't think I can dive right into like the RD path and like an internship and grad school. Not to mention like, not to like dive into all this right off the bat, but it's like I had student debt for my undergrad degree as well. So, and I knew that the internship was going to cost money, and I would be even more in debt. So I was like, I just think, based on what I want to do with nutrition, which is not clinical nutrition and medical nutrition therapy, I just think like the DTR path matches more what I want to do. And I didn't want like, just because the RD like looks better, on the resume and things like that, I didn't want that to be like what ultimately informed my choices, and go more with like what felt like it matched my preferences and my goals.
That is such a good perspective, that the debt and then what are you going to do with nutrition? Having that honest conversation with yourself is so important. And a lot of people just feel forced to go for that RD, but DTR might just be what they need to be successful. So how long did it take you to study for the exam, and when did you become an NDTR?
I think I took the DTR exam like a couple months after I graduated from school, because that was just like when you could schedule it. So, and like when I was in school, they kind of like promoted the DTR exam as like, you can take this right away. Like when you're done with school, you can just dive right in. And a lot of my professors were saying like, oh, you all can pass the DTR exam right now if you sat down and took it. Like, so it was very much like, oh, this is a breeze. Like, so I honestly like didn't really study, which, you know, is what it is, but I did end up passing. I mean, I looked over stuff like a little bit, but I didn't like go crazy with studying or anything. But then I like sat down to take the exam and I was like, this is like the real deal, you know? And it was harder than I thought it was going to be. And it took me like hours and hours to finish. But yeah, I did end up passing. So thank God.
Well, that's cool that you didn't have that pressure. I think a lot of the nerve wracking with the nervous part of the NDTR credential is like the scariness of the test. So having that confidence going in clearly worked for you. So that's a good study strategy. I love it. So NDTR, when did you decide to do your own private practice and open up your coaching business?
I actually started the private practice during COVID, because I had like all this extra time on my hands, and I was like, I'm unemployed, and it was something that I've been like thinking about doing for a while, and I had sort of like given like friends some nutrition advice, and I started following like other dietitians on Instagram that have like private practices, and I was just like, you know what, now's the time. I'm free to just do anything at the moment. So yeah, that's when I started that. But prior to the private practice, I like right after I got my DTR exam, my credential, I worked at WIC, so Women, Infant, and Children. So I did that for a full year after I got my credential. And that was in North St. Louis. I live in St. Louis. I don't know if you knew. Yeah, so that was in like North City. And I worked at like I would kind of like rotate between a few different just healthcare clinics around there. So yeah.
Nice. So it sounds like you took advantage of COVID and made something great out of that. But quickly, how was your experience working at WIC? You want to talk about that a little bit for our audience?
Yeah, definitely. So I was working with, I mean, obviously, like if you know what WIC is, they provide food vouchers for people who, it's sort of like SNAP, but for pregnant people, breastfeeding people, infants, and children under 5. So the communities that I was working with were just like suffering with a lot of food insecurity, not to mention like all the other traumas that come with just not having your like basic needs met. So it was a really good experience. It ended up being really draining, because I would see up to like 30 patients a day sometimes, just like back to back to back doing nutrition counseling. So I would have like, sometimes it would be like 5 minutes with them, or sometimes it would be like 15 minutes, just like depending on what their needs were. And there was a lot of high risk people that I worked with. So yeah, just not a lot of time to like decompress between counseling patients. But I really did like love working with the people that I worked with. And I felt like it was really eye-opening. The role almost ended up like, sometimes you would feel more like a social worker than a nutritionist, because it's like when people's basic needs aren't met and they have like all this other stuff going on, they're not as concerned with nutrition, which makes like total sense. So sometimes I would like end up functioning more as like someone who could like refer them to, whether it's like healthcare that they needed, or they need to get diapers somewhere for free, or just like basic things. And I think like one of my main goals when I was working there was just like, I wanted to be like a provider that they could trust, because I feel like there's so much like mistrust within like that community, and like poor communities, people of color, and healthcare providers. So I was like, I just want to, show that like I know this dynamic exists. I know like why it exists, and it's totally valid. And if I could like just be somebody that they could trust and talk to, I felt like that was everything. But at the same time, that kind of opened up like the floodgates of like them telling me, stories and trauma that they've been through. So I ended up, there's something called like secondary trauma that happens with like caretaking professions a lot, where it's like the trauma is passed from the person to you, to like the provider, and then you kind of like carry that around with you, and if you don't like learn how to kind of like release those things, then it can just be like really heavy and really draining. So yeah, so that was kind of like my experience there. And I don't think all WIC jobs are like that, but just this like particular community that I was working with, yeah, it was rough. So, and then towards the end of my time there, I experienced some sexual harassment, not from my clients or patients, but from coworkers. And so yeah, so I ended up like making the hard decision to speak up about it and tell my boss, and then my boss wasn't on the same page as me, and didn't have my back. So yeah, so that was a learning experience, and I was kind of like, it's time to move on from this job. And I kind of learned too, like, this is why people don't speak up about these things, because you never know how your boss or the people above you are going to respond to it, and whether or not they're going to be supportive. So yeah, here I am.
That's heavy. That's a lot of stuff. I wasn't expecting that. But the way you talked about it, I do have to say, it sounds like you listened and you learned and you heard stories, and you didn't brush it off like your boss did, like you know. So I think it speaks volumes to who you are as a person. And I want to bring up, so now you have your private practice that you're doing that you started with COVID. How has your experience at WIC affected how you set up your private practice?
Yeah, I think I learned so much at WIC, and it kind of helps me just like put nutrition in perspective of like what health is. Like nutrition is just like one small piece of a person's overall health. And so I think that definitely informs like how I approach counseling clients now, which is like, of course, I think nutrition is important, and like I think eating healthy can have an impact on your health, but at the same time, like there's so much more to it. Like for one, like are your basic needs being met? And then there's stress, there's physical activity, there's just like mental and emotional health. So sometimes I think people are trying to like use nutrition as like, okay, this is gonna like solve all my problems. And it's like, if the root of the problem is in one of these other like areas, like if you're not sleeping, if you're not getting like a full night's sleep, that can really affect your overall health. And also just like access to food, access to healthy foods, and not just healthy foods, but foods that you're used to, and foods that are culturally appropriate for you. So
Yeah. I really like that awareness that nutrition is not going to save everything, that you have to approach a person as a whole person, and there's so much involved in healthcare. So with that thought process, when you're counseling or you're working with your patients, what is your approach on dealing with these other issues, and how do you stay within your scope of practice as an NDTR when you're touching on all these very important issues that should not be overlooked?
Yeah, so with individual people, I have to say, like, I haven't had very many clients who are in like that lower, well, not necessarily, but who are in like that lower income bracket is what I was going to say. Just because, like I said before, I don't think that that's something that is necessarily at like the front of their mind always. So as far as working with people, I think I always try to keep like my scope of practice in mind, and just making sure that I make referrals like when it's appropriate. So another thing that was really helpful about WIC is we made like tons of referrals, and we had like all these brochures of local resources. So if I do have a client that needs one of those things, or is like even just looking for a primary care provider that is health at every size friendly, or something like that, I can kind of go to like my resources and find something that I feel like would be helpful for them. So, and then just always like when I'm counseling, I like to like always put like the disclaimer on it and be like, but let's look at all the other aspects of health too, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not like selling it as a quick fix or a, you know, this is definitely going to solve all your problems.
Yeah, so that makes sense. So having the referrals, and then just having that, making your client aware that nutrition is not the only thing for your health, but there's other things to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So you have a focus, it looks like, on intuitive eating. Is that correct? Yeah. So
Yeah.
what made you kind of focus in on that aspect of nutrition?
Yeah, so intuitive eating, which I'm sure like you know what it is. I feel like it's really big on Instagram. That's like how I first learned about it actually. And I was like, "Ooh, what's this?" I felt like all through school, like my undergrad was really like nutrition-wise, it was really traditional. So like there was no like intuitive eating, no mindful eating. It was very much like weight management focused and just all those like traditional ways of like going about nutrition. So when I found intuitive eating, I was like, I feel like this aligns with like what I felt like was missing. And I just feel like I just felt like it was really inclusive, which I liked, and didn't focus so much on like an intentional weight loss aspect. Um, so yeah, as far as working with people, oh, sorry, what I was gonna say before, when I was like, do you know what intuitive eating is? So intuitive eating is just eating in accordance with your body's natural hunger and satiety cues. So working with patients or clients, it's focusing on like how can they become more aligned with and in tune with their body's natural like signals. So instead of using like external cues to tell them when they're going to eat, like a calorie counting app, or in according to like food rules that they have, just like we all have so many food rules and like in the back of our mind that we don't realize. So just helping kind of go away from those external cues and kind of back to trusting your body. So yeah.
Yeah, that was very well explained, and I think that's super relevant. It's something that is, yeah, it is popular on Instagram, but you definitely have to take time to learn it and understand it and incorporate it. It's like a whole new way of thinking about food, and it can be challenging.
Definitely. And I think if like you don't fully take the time to learn about it, it can kind of backfire. Like if, you know, because some people who don't fully know what it is think like, if I just let myself eat whatever I want all the time and just give myself like that unconditional permission to eat, I'm just gonna go like hog wild and just eat like everything inside. But that's not actually, you know, how it ends up going down. But I actually have taken like a couple of courses with London Center of Intuitive Eating. So that's kind of like how I got my training in intuitive eating. And that's the director of that is Laura Thomas, which she's kind of like big on Instagram too. And she wrote a book called Just Eat It.
That's cool. So I like that you've taken the time to really dig into intuitive eating. It sounds like you probably know way more about it than I could ever imagine myself knowing. So switching a little bit from intuitive eating, I know NDTR audience are going to be curious about the process of setting up your website and finding clients, and I know you started pretty recently, but how has that been?
Yeah, it's been fun. It's been fun because I have the extra time, or I've had the extra time because of COVID. I think if like it wasn't COVID and I was just living my like regular life working, I think it'd be stressful, like to just have all those extra things to do, because it just takes time to kind of like, it's kind of like a trial and error thing. It takes time to figure out like what works and what doesn't, which I think can be like really intimidating for people who tend to wait. Like, I feel like I used to be one of those people that kind of like waited till it's absolutely perfect to like do it or start it or put something out there. But with this, I was kind of just like, it's going to be like, it's going to evolve over time, and that's fine. And it's not going to be perfect right away. So I've kind of just been learning like what works and what doesn't. But the first thing I did was start my website. And I used Squarespace just because that's like all the ads that I've heard on podcasts. Like Squarespace, build it beautiful or whatever, you know. So yeah, I used Squarespace. It was pretty easy. But even with that, there's like a learning curve. Because I'm not like skilled at graphic design or anything really on the computer. I mean, I know I'm obviously like a millennial, so I know the basics, but
well, your website looks great, so you're fooling me with your lack of knowledge there. I think it looks good.
Yeah, so I use Squarespace, and then I did a ton of research on like the scope of practice of an NDTR, which I feel like a lot of people are not super aware of. Like, even nutrition professionals are not super aware of like what a DTR can do. And I found like with that research, I was like, I can do a lot. Like, DTRs can do so much. Like, because I just wanted to make sure, like, before I started a private practice, is this something that I'm like that's within my credential to be able to counsel people, and like where does that like scope of practice stop, just so I can like make sure that if I need to refer somebody to an RD, that I'm doing that at like the appropriate times. So I did all that research on the Eat Right Pro or Eat Right website. Yeah, and there's like tons of resources. Like, if you dig deep, there's like all these articles and that they've put out that explain very like detailed and specifically what the difference between an RD and a DTR is.
That's helpful. So are all of those resources on the eatright.org website, and you just have to do some clicking around? Or did you find them somewhere else?
What's the other website that's like officially there's Eat Right, and then there's Journal. I think I looked on like Journal of Nutrition and Dietetics too.
Okay.
But everything that I found was like within it's all like resources that the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics has. But I think I still have some of those, so I can I'll look after this and I can send it to you.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll put all the information down in the comments section of the video. I'm sure people would really appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah, so what else? I did get liability insurance. So like within all those resources, there's instructions for how to and what insurance you should have, and where to get it, and just to make sure that like everything's covered. And then I got like a small business license from the city of St. Louis where I live. So I was like, I just want to have all like the bases covered before I actually start this. And I had the time to do it. So I think with the insurance and the business license, it was like $200 something total. Like, so not super expensive.
Yeah. That's awesome. So what I gathered is you get a website, you do your research on your scope of practice, and then you get like the boring things, the insurance and the liability, which are super important for that foundation, which super helpful information. So then you have all of this stuff now. What was the process in picking your prices and trying to find clients? Can you give a little spiel on that?
Yeah. Um, so picking the prices was, I think I've changed them a couple of times since I started to, because I wanted it to be accessible, but I also didn't want to, like, you see all these things online, like, don't like devalue the work of a nutritionist or a dietitian by making your prices too low. And it does take, like, it takes time to work with a client, especially like when you first, like that initial counseling session, and especially starting as like a relatively new business. It's kind of, it takes time to like prepare for that appointment, and then time to like actually do the appointment. So yeah, so I wanted to make those prices like appropriate as possible, while still trying to make it accessible for people, because that was like part of my mission. So I think I just did like more research online, and I looked at what other nutrition counselors have set their prices at, just to see like what the, like, like what's the ballpark. And I looked on like some of those websites that list practitioners, like all different kinds of practitioners. I think there's one called like WellSet, one called like Chara Health. So you can look on there and like go through providers in your area and see what their prices are. So I kind of use that for like just a benchmark. And then later on, I added like a pay what you can option. Because just thinking about like accessibility, and I wanted as many people. I didn't want that to be like a barrier for some people, especially starting out, where it's like I don't have that many clients. So I have like time and space to be able to give to people. So, and that's the thing too, is like when people are like, oh, if you have to pay what you can, everyone's gonna like, no matter how much money they have or how much money they make, everybody's gonna use that pay what you can. But I think it's not really like that. I think people who have the money actually pay the full price, and then people who don't and need like that support, they can take advantage of it. So I've found that even though I've added the pay what you can, most people still pay the full price. So
That is, wow, you're super informative. I feel like people are getting a lot of good information from everything you're just giving out for free. So I really appreciate your transparency and honesty. And it's really cool seeing you have this theme of like being aware of other people and other people's situations, and just, I guess, this wokeness, for lack of a better term. So I want to bring up the articles that you have shared on your LinkedIn tree with diet culture and all of this. What is your perspective, or what is your approach? You kind of talked about this a little bit, but your approach on nutrition and racism in this country, and how you're approaching and attacking that.
oh my gosh. Yeah, well, well, so you had a question on your thing talking about like diversity in the field. So I think there definitely is a huge problem with diversity, and just racism in general within the dietetics profession. And not only with like, not only just the fact that like dietitians are mostly white, but it's how dietitians, like the lack of education and lack of knowledge and lack of awareness in those providers and how they make recommendations to clients who might be like from different cultures, and just being aware that like if a food is not like inherently white, it doesn't need to automatically be labeled as unhealthy. So I think like a lot of dietitians will see food from a different culture and automatically think like bad, unhealthy, like because not because it is, but because it's different. And like vice versa, you don't have to eat white foods to be healthy. So like you don't have to eat quinoa, you don't have to eat kale, you don't have to eat things that aren't familiar to you, that aren't comforting to you. And I think that's just like, it's been, what am I trying to say? Like it's been overlooked. Like that's a spot where dietitians have to do like a lot more research and education, and just being intentional about that. Like not everybody eats the food that you eat. And that's okay, you know. So yeah, I think there's that, and then there's also like I said earlier about dietitians being mostly white, and I think that has to do with like it not being that accessible to become a RD or DTR. So like it costs money to go to, it costs tons of money to go to get your undergrad, and then it costs even more money to do an internship, and then the match rate for that internship is like 50%. So you have to get like full-blown straight A's, like 4.0 to well, that's not true, don't listen to that, but that's what they push, that's what they pressure. So it's really competitive. And then beyond that, I just think like universities need to start pushing more diversity in the student population, and not just diversity, but like anti-racism, and hiring more diverse staff too, because if students don't see like themselves reflected in like their advisors, they're going to be less likely to go for a degree like that. So yeah, I mean, it's complicated, but I think first and foremost, like if you're a white provider in like the space of nutrition and dietetics, I think you have a responsibility to be able to counsel people who are not just like you, because then you're missing a whole group of people who aren't getting what they need from you and what you're supposed to provide for them. So
yeah, I love that. I think your point of saying like sometimes when people have this conversation, there's like this idea that like white people are terrible, which is not the case. I think what's important is just understanding that like there's different cultures and there's different foods, and being aware that what you're eating is not you shouldn't put that on everybody. I think when you're so saturated in this field, you kind of practice what you preach, and you just want to push that on everyone else. And having that awareness and that understanding can make you be able to work with any population. Like me as an African American woman, if I'm working with a highly Asian population, I need to learn their food and their culture and be mindful of that. So I really appreciate that your perspective on that, and then just your understanding and your heart to listen. You've given us so much information about starting a private practice, this idea, working at WIC, and just wokeness in the field of nutrition. Is there anything else you want to leave with the audience? Any words of encouragement for anyone interested in starting an NDTR private practice, or this conversation on race?
I think if you're thinking about it, just go for it. I mean, I think as a DTR, it can be really like, am I allowed to do this? Like, I think there's a lot of, what's the word for when imposter syndrome. And also I think that is partly because of like the lack of, I just think that DTR credential is really underutilized and underpromoted. So people don't know like what you can do as a DTR. So yeah, I really think like we have so much knowledge and experience, and yeah, it might be like intimidating to be like, oh, I'm just an NDTR or whatever. But hopefully, I think just with like how competitive the RD internship is, and just more people kind of like becoming aware of how expensive it is, and how much like debt you're taking on, I hope that like more people will utilize this path, because if you don't want to work in a hospital or practice medical nutrition therapy, then I think DTR is like a great option. So yeah, I don't know, just go for it.
That's super encouraging. And so lastly, Irene, how do people find you? How do people like kind of stalk you and see what you're doing online?
You can follow me at Nutrition by Irene on Instagram, and my website is nutritionbyirene.com.
And we will link this down below. Thank you everyone for watching. Please let us know something you took away from this interview, and make sure you check out Irene online, and we'll see you in our next NDTR Spotlight.